He saw parallels between Trump's rhetoric of election fraud and Adolf Hitler's insistence to his followers at the Nuremberg rallies that he was both a victim and their savior. Quote, "This is a Reichstag moment," Milley told aides, "the gospel of the Fuhrer." Now, there's an inherent shock in hearing the country's top military leader comparing the U.S. president to Hitler, but it's worth drilling down on this a little because according to the new reporting, Mark Milley wasn't just casually throwing around Nazi references as epithets to disparage President Trump. He was using historical context. This wasn't a case of Trump is bad, so I'll call him Nazi names. Milley saw a very specific historical analogy in what Donald Trump was doing. In February of 1933, the German parliament building, the Reichstag in Berlin, went up in flames. German Chancellor Adolf Hitler, who up until that point had attained power by democratic means, blamed the communists and said it was the beginning of a terror campaign by the left. On that premise, his government proceeded to suspend constitutional rights, giving Hitler the power to rule by fiat, and Germany literally turned from a democratic to an authoritarian state. In the weeks after the November election, Milley feared that Donald Trump was creating his own version of the Reichstag fire, an emergency that justifies the suspension of the rules that demands an authoritarian response. The election was rigged and stolen by shadowy left-wing forces. Therefore, we must stop the counting of the votes. We must suspend democracy. Milley feared that Trump would attempt to use the military to achieve this suspension of democracy. Instead, it took the form of an insurrection that sought to stop the certification of an election, an insurrection that succeeded for a few hours but ultimately failed. And given that it failed, given that Trump did leave office and democracy did prevail, it is tempting to leave this all behind us, to read Carol Leonnig and Phil Rucker's book as a kind of an historical artifact, reporting on a period of our history that is thankfully behind us, except it is not over. Donald Trump has never had more of an iron grip over the Republican Party than he does right now. Joining me now is one of the most perceptive thinkers on this subject, Tim Snyder, professor of history at Yale University. His books include On Tyranny, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century, 20 Lessons from the 20th Century. Tim Snyder, Professor Snyder, good to see you tonight. One of the reasons I want to talk to you is because of an essay that you wrote barely a month into the Trump administration back in 2017 titled The Reichstag Warning, in which you write, "The Reichstag fire shows how quickly a modern republic can be transformed into an authoritarian regime. The American founding fathers knew that the democracy they were creating was vulnerable to an aspiring tyrant who might seize upon some dramatic event as grounds for the suspension of our rights. As James Madison nicely put it, tyranny arises, quote, on some favorable emergency." So I want to get your response, Professor Snyder, to this reporting about what General Milley was fearing in the last days of the Trump administration.
Well, my personal response is that I'm grateful that General Milley reads history. And I think the broad significance of all this is that our leaders and our aspiring leaders should be reading history. There are two really important references in what you just cited. The first is Federalist Paper 48, in which Madison, who himself thought very historically, recognized how fragile republics are and recognized that people who would want to overturn them will use a real, or in the case of Mr. Trump this time, an artificial emergency. And the second important reference is the Reichstag fire. And again, I think General Milley was right to be thinking in those directions, this idea that Mr. Trump was a victim, and therefore because he was a victim, everything was permitted. That is familiar from fascism. And using something to do with the parliament, in this case our Congress, as the pretext is also familiar. The idea that he lost the election and something dramatic had to happen to parliament, that's terribly familiar. So I'm grateful that General Milley is referring to history. I think that's very important.
One of the things you told Dana Milbank this week, the journalist Dana Milbank, is that a failed coup is practice for a successful coup. Your view is not that this insurrection failed, we're glad it failed, and now we know a lot better. You're worried that to the people who were inspired to do what they did on January 6th, they remain inspired.
Well, we're now working within the framework of a big lie. I mean, one of the things I was trying to explain last fall is that once Mr. Trump makes this big claim that he actually won the election, we're going to have a polarized society, and we're going to have one political party which makes it their single issue, which is basically what's happened. So long as we're in that framework of a big lie, we can expect one of the political parties to try to rig the system. Because after all, if you tell people that the other side cheated, you're basically promising your people that you're going to cheat as well. And this scenario is now playing out with the voter suppression, with the culture wars. We get ourselves to a scenario where in 2024, the Republican candidate could lose by a lot, let's say 10 million votes, and you could still rig up some kind of electoral college majority. And then we'd be in a position of much greater tension, sadly, than we were in 2021.
You were talking to us a lot last fall about this, and it's sad because the things you were saying seemed exaggerated and seemed big, and yet every last one of them has come to pass. What are you worried about? Do you think that we are going to be stuck in this situation heading into 2022 and 2024 elections, or do you think there's some way to understand this, to be students of history, and not let this continue?
Look, I mean, as I said at the top, the encouraging thing is that some people listen to history. And if you compare 2016 to 2020, I mean, I was saying the same things as you're kind enough to remember for 4 years. But there was a difference between how Americans reacted in 2020 to how they reacted in 2016. In 2016, we were very much in the mode of saying, we're exceptional, our institutions are going to save us. In 2020, there were an awful lot of people who were thinking actively, thinking ahead, but also thinking historically and making preparations for worst case scenarios. And those preparations are, in fact, what saved us. So, the institutions only save us if we make those institutions live, if we care about them, if we act for them. So I'm neither a pessimist nor an optimist. I think that the possible dark scenarios are very much with us. We could very well lose our democracy in the next 4 years. But I'm pleased that people are paying more attention to history. And I think if we understand that America is not outside of history, that things that have happened elsewhere can happen here in various forms, if we understand that, then we've got a fighting chance.